Welcome to our first mini lecture on performance-enhancing drugs. As we work through our lectures today, we're going to be talking about the history and types of drug use among athletes, and it is something that's gone on for quite a long time. We'll talk about testing, the use of stimulants, the use of steroids, and then some other PEDs. So first of all, why are we even talking about it? What's our concern here? And we touched on some of these during our class discussion, our discussion question, but reasons for concern here include the fact that athletes are role models and that people don't like to see young people's role models engaging in drug use. And then, of course, that drugs may provide an unfair advantage, that if some athletes are taking drugs and others aren't, then it's really not a level playing field. And then, of course, regardless of the ability level or age of the athlete, if they are taking a performance-enhancing drug, they may be risking their health or even their life by using that drug. Now, we talked about types of drug use among the general population, and we really do have the same kinds of drug use among athletes. So when we talk about performance-enhancing drugs, we need to talk about that as a specific category because we also see athletes using drugs for therapeutic reasons. It could be for a specific medical problem, or it could be from the pain that can come from pushing a body to its limits under a rigorous training regimen. We do see athletes use mood-altering drugs, possibly for the same reasons as other populations. We've got one of our, of course, Olympic swimmers engaging in some mood-altering there in our photo. And then performance-enhancing drugs. So that third category, the one that we'll focus on here in our lecture, for the purposes of relieving pain, possibly increasing stamina and strength, or maybe getting up or stimulated for competition. We've seen a lot of coverage of this in recent years. And we actually got this opinion from Jose Canseco, a baseball player, that the challenge isn't really to find a top athlete who has used PEDs, it's to find someone who hasn't. So just one perspective on it, but that's kind of the perception that we're getting here in the 21st century. In terms of the data, what the data tells us in terms of the use of PEDs among top athletes. So the 2000 Olympics in Australia, there was a study done of 2,000 athletes, and the samples and the data, the paperwork that they filled out for those samples, and they found that each competitor, the average competitor, had taken 6 to 7 legal medications in the previous 3 days. So this included everything from supplements to pain relief medication, even over the counter, to cold medication. So lots of different ways that those athletes were engaging in drug use. Not all of it performance enhancing, but of course, there can be some issues crossover there as well, and we'll talk about that when we get to testing. Now, this isn't really a new problem as much as we talk about it now like it is. This is something that's been going on since ancient times. Some of the early products that our ancestors used may not really have had any effect on physical performance. It may just have been a placebo value, and we still actually see that today. We do know that the ancient Greeks who participated in the Olympics and that Aztec athletes did use stimulants derived from plants. And one reason why this may be is that those kinds of competitions probably developed as a means of training for war or hunting. They tended to be the same kinds of activities. And those societies tend to use those kinds of stimulant drugs when they're engaged in the actual activities. So perhaps in the games that simulated it, its use was also accepted. A little more recently, we did see some early use of stimulants around the turn of the last century. We're used to hearing about strychnine as a poison, but at low doses it is, albeit a dangerous one, a central nervous system stimulant. Of course, at higher doses we see those convulsions and death that you may see on CSI or in a murder mystery. But we do know that in 1904, the winner of the Olympic marathon attributed part of his success to the use of brandy and strychnine. So, despite the dangers, we did see some use of this continue perhaps even as late as the 1960s. We also saw cocaine used as an early stimulant. I remember Mariana's coca wine that was available for purchase. It was promoted by the French cycling team, so really no attempt to hide their use of that particular stimulant. And then as pure cocaine became more commonly manufactured and available, we saw athletes using just cocaine as a stimulant in preparing for sport. And then finally, caffeine. Many athletes over time have used either coffee or pure caffeine as a stimulant there as well. So moving a little more forward into the modern era, we're going to talk about the history of amphetamine use. Now originally, athletes and trainers saw some potential benefits for amphetamines over other stimulants. It was more potent than caffeine, but safer than strychnine. So it really seemed to be the ideal drug to help athletes improve their performance. It was pretty widely in use by athletes soon after they were introduced in the 1930s. And some of the early sports that were use was reported include cycling, soccer, and boxing. However, of course, we know amphetamine use is not consequence-free, and we did see adverse events reported that included some deaths in the Olympics in the 1950s, and then in the 1960 Olympics, where we started to kind of see the tide turn on drug use in the Olympics, there was a cyclist who died, and then several other athletes who were hospitalized because of amphetamine use. So when we see testing begin to become a priority, this is probably in the 1960s. And it isn't really a comprehensive or well-designed approach. We see some sports begin testing some athletes for some drugs. And of course, without a comprehensive approach, we did see problems continue. By 1968, the IOC established rules specifically for Olympians to disqualify athletes who used drugs which were on their ban list or drugs who refused to be tested. So this is really this decade of the 1960s is when we saw the tide start to turn. Now, as we look at testing specifically in the context of the Olympics, we've seen an incredible expansion. So in the 1968, a random sample of athletes gave about 700 samples for testing. And by the time we got to the 2012 Olympics, we had over 150 scientists working at a lab that was open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to process all the samples that were given and collected. So a really dramatic change in the extent and volume of the testing. Here specifically in the United States, it's been very interesting to watch the NFL continue to deal with some of its issues among its players, because in the 1960s, it was a really common thing for football players to use amphetamines during games, and they were distributed even by the training staff. By 1971, though, we do see a change in that attitude. The NFL banned the distribution by team officials, but there was no initial testing of players. So if they obtained the drug on their own, there was no ban against them using it. Of course, we've seen that change pretty dramatically. Current NFL policy, of course, does ban all use of amphetamines and many other drugs. New in recent years has been a ban on HGH as well. So we're continuing to see in the NFL and in other kinds of sports governing bodies, the list of banned substances continue. Another drug that we've seen used for performance enhancement in history is steroids. We'll talk more about that later in the lecture. But it's the first use that we see for this was actually the use of testosterone for weight gain in people who are malnourished. Think maybe concentration camp survivors. And it was actually quite successful for people to help recover their health after that kind of experience. Now, the Soviets were the first ones who recorded to actually start using testosterone to build up athletes, and this was in the 1950s. Now, by the 1960s, athletes around the world, including the United States, were using steroids. We saw primarily in weightlifters and bodybuilders, although also in track and field athletes as well. And again, by the 1970s, we're seeing around that same time period, we started to see testing for steroids at athletic events as well. Now, a population where this use got to be particularly high profile was in East German athletes. So in the 60s, 70s, and even into the 1980s, both male and female athletes in the East German Olympic system were given steroids called vitamins. So they weren't even aware that they were taking them. And there's some very serious side effects that can go with the doses that they were taking, including depression, diabetes, kidney disease, and then, of course, those androgenic effects, the characteristics like broad shoulders, prominent Adam's apple, that we see deeper voices. We see those effects in women, things about them that physically begin to resemble men. And the really sad thing here is that when female athletes stop taking those steroids, they lose some of the performance enhancement, but those androgenic effects, they remain. So it's not like they're their bodies are able to change back. So really tragic that those athletes were exposed to that that level of damage without giving the option to choose whether it was something that they were interested in participating in or not. One of our more recent scandals about performance-enhancing drugs here in the United States was the Balco scandal. So this began with rumors that certain professional ball players were using steroids, and by June 2003, we had evidence that professional baseball players were using this previously unknown steroid that they didn't really have any tests, that the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency hadn't really developed a test for yet. So the founder of the Balco Labs was implicated, and as he was deposed, we started to see kind of the dominoes fall with professional athletes from various different sports being taken down through that scandal. Now, of course, part of the battle throughout this whole history has been the battle over testing. How do we know who's using, who isn't, and how do we keep a level playing field, a fair playing field for athletes in various sports? We really saw some pretty dramatic developments in the 1980s. So as we started to see reports of drug use, along with that same just say no intolerance of drug use, just here in the United States in general, we started to see sports organizations adopt stricter testing guidelines and start to develop longer and longer lists of substances that were banned. Of course, we know pretty well that despite these strict guidelines and long lists and increasingly more sensitive and specific tests, we're not really seeing the use of performance-enhancing drugs stop. We're just seeing those who develop those drugs staying just ahead on the leading edge of the testing. So in response, we're seeing that pressure on athletes not to avoid taking the drugs, perhaps, but to avoid detection. And of course, athletes are facing those challenges, that pressure to deliver, that pressure to keep up with that quote-unquote everyone else who may be taking the performance-enhancing drugs, competing for the spot on the team, and that pressure to continue performing better that we see among people who are very physically competitive. So we see this kind of continuous dance between athletes trying to do their best, maybe being exposed to something that might be considered a supplement, could end up being something that contained a bad substance that they might, a banned substance that they might even not even know about. Other athletes who may choose to use illegal performance-enhancing drugs to try to maintain their position or move forward, and then the testing agencies to try to figure out who's using what and trying to keep the playing field fair. So a real constant dance between all those groups, trying to hopefully in the end up with athletes who are able to perform well and fairly and continue to stay healthy. So we're going to wrap up our first lecture on performance-enhancing drugs here, and we'll be back to talk about specific kinds of drugs that are used as performance enhancers.